Halfway up the frozen mountain road, Ranger started clawing at the truck door, like he already knew what waited in the woods. The truck tires slipped on black ice as Walter Hayes fought the steering wheel with both hands. Snow hammered the windshield. Beside him, Ranger suddenly lunged forward, claws scraping the dashboard, growling low toward the trees, like something out there was moving with them. Walter hadn't heard his dog make that sound since the war. Then the headlights caught an old wooden sign half buried in snow. Bitterroot Ridge, Dead End Road. And Ranger would not stop barking. What do you think the dog sensed first? The church sat at the edge of the mountain road, like it had been there forever. White paint peeling, snow still clinging to the pine trees behind it, even though spring had already touched the valley below. Pickup trucks lined the gravel lot, beside polished SUVs with out-of-state plates. People spoke quietly in small groups, hands wrapped around paper cups of coffee that steamed in the cold Montana air. Walter Hayes stayed inside his truck long after everyone else had gone in. Ranger sat beside him on the bench seat, 12 years old now. Gray around the muzzle, one ear bent from an old ranch accident years ago. The German Shepherd watched the church doors without moving. Walter rubbed his thumb against the worn wedding ring on his hand. 40 years. 40 years married to Evelyn Hayes, and somehow the church waiting ahead of him felt less familiar than a roadside diner. "You ready, boy?" he asked softly. Ranger looked at him but didn't move. Neither did Walter. The church bell rang overhead. One sharp metallic boom rolled through the valley. Walter flinched hard before he could stop himself. His shoulders tightened instantly. Breath caught halfway in his chest. For half a second, the cold mountain air disappeared, replaced by heat and dust, and the memory of distant mortar fire cracking across desert hills somewhere a lifetime ago. Ranger pressed his nose against Walter's arm immediately, grounding him, pulling him back. Walter swallowed hard and nodded once. "I know," he whispered. Inside, the church smelled like old wood and melted candle wax. Evelyn's coffin rested near the altar beneath soft yellow light. Wildflowers surrounded it instead of expensive arrangements. That part at least felt like her. She'd always hated anything too polished. Walter paused near the entrance, uncertain where to sit. That hesitation lasted too long, because Diane noticed. His stepdaughter crossed the aisle toward him, wearing a black wool coat and the tight smile she always used around him in public. "Walter," she said quietly, "we saved family seating up front." For one brief second, something eased inside him. Then she pointed toward the back row. "You'll probably be more comfortable back there with Ranger, not with us." She didn't say the words. She didn't have to. Walter simply nodded. That was what he'd done for years. Nodded, avoided conflict. Stayed quiet to keep peace inside a family that never truly became his. Ranger walked beside him down the aisle while conversations dimmed around them. Walter felt the stares. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. Awkward. Like people weren't sure how important he was supposed to be here. He sat in the last row beneath an old stained glass window, showing a shepherd carrying a lamb through snow. Ranger settled at his boots immediately. The service began. A pastor Walter barely knew spoke about Evelyn's kindness, her volunteer work, her garden behind the farmhouse, the pies she baked for church fundraisers every winter. Then Diane stood to speak. She cried halfway through the first sentence. Real tears, too, Walter could tell. That almost made it harder, because grief didn't erase what came before it. "My mother loved this family more than anything," Diane said, voice trembling. "Everything she did was for us, for this home, for the people she loved most. Us." Walter stared at the floorboards. Cole spoke next. His suit looked expensive and uncomfortable at the same time. "She kept this family together," he said, "even when times were hard." Walter almost laughed at that. Not because it was false, because it was incomplete. Nobody mentioned the oxygen tanks near the end, or the nights Walter slept sitting upright beside Evelyn's bed because she couldn't breathe lying flat. Nobody mentioned him lifting her into the shower when her legs stopped working properly last winter. Nobody mentioned the old man who had spent 2 years cooking meals she could barely eat while her own children visited, mostly on holidays. The bell rang again outside, another sharp, metallic crack. Walter's fingers curled instantly against the pew. Ranger lifted his head at once, pressing against Walter's leg harder this time. The dog understood before people did. Always had. Walter focused on the feel of Ranger's fur beneath his shaking hand until the noise inside his head settled again. By the time the funeral ended, snow had started falling outside, small flakes drifting sideways through gray mountain wind. People gathered in clusters near the church entrance, speaking in hushed voices about weather and roads and casseroles. Diane hugged guests near the door while Cole talked quietly with two men Walter recognized from a land development company out near Bozeman. That caught his attention. Only for a moment. Then he looked away. Ranger stayed close as Walter stepped outside into the cold. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked if he needed company. He reached the side of the church near the fellowship hall when he heard Diane's voice through the partially open door. "We need to move quickly before winter," she said. Someone answered too quietly to hear. Then Diane again. "The real family deserves clarity before lawyers complicate everything." Walter froze. Snow collected slowly across the shoulders of his coat. Cole laughed softly inside. The ranch should have been sold years ago. Walter stood there for several seconds longer than he should have. Not angry. That was the strange part. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into a man after carrying something too heavy for too many years. Ranger leaned lightly against his leg. Walter finally turned away. The drive home took 20 minutes through winding mountain roads glazed with wet snow. Evelyn's scarf still hung from the truck's passenger seat. Her gloves still sat in the center console, where she'd left them back in October, before the hospital stays started becoming permanent. The farmhouse appeared through the trees just after dusk, lights glowing warm behind the windows. But it didn't feel warm anymore. Cars already filled the driveway. Diane's SUV, Cole's truck, a few relatives Walter barely knew. They were inside already talking about what came next. Walter shut off the engine but didn't get out. The garage smelled faintly of gasoline, cold concrete, and old hay from winters past. He sat there in darkness while the engine ticked softly as it cooled. Ranger climbed into the back seat, then returned again like he couldn't decide whether to stay close or keep watch. Hours passed. At some point, laughter drifted faintly from inside the house. Walter stared at the steering wheel without moving. 40 years, and somehow he already felt erased from the place he still lived. Finally, Ranger rested his head on Walter's knee. Walter looked down at him. "You're all I got now, huh?" The dog's tail tapped once against the seat. 3 days later, the family would gather in Helena for the reading of Evelyn's will. And Walter Hayes would learn just how little space his name still occupied in the life they had built together. The law office sat on the 4th floor of an old brick building overlooking downtown Helena. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the rooftops outside. People hurried along the sidewalks below, with coffee cups tucked into gloved hands. Normal life. Busy life. Walter felt separated from all of it. Ranger waited in the truck downstairs. Dogs weren't allowed in the office building, and Walter hated leaving him alone. He checked the parking lot twice from the elevator window before walking into the conference room. Diane and Cole were already there. Neither stood when he entered. A long, polished table filled most of the room. Coffee steamed from paper cups near stacks of legal folders. The attorney, a tired-looking man named Richard Bell, adjusted his glasses and gave Walter a polite nod. Mr. Hayes. Walter took the empty chair closest to the door. Not beside the family, closest to the exit. Cole leaned back in his seat, wearing an expensive fleece jacket with some hunting company logo stitched across the chest. He kept checking his phone while Diane reviewed paperwork with sharp, impatient movements. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then Richard cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I'll keep this as straightforward as possible." Straightforward. Walter almost appreciated the word. No speeches. No pretending grief still held the room together. The attorney began reading through property descriptions, savings accounts, retirement funds, insurance details. Evelyn's name sounded strange inside legal language, reduced down to percentages and signatures and account numbers. The farmhouse went to Diane and Cole jointly. The cattle leases, the equipment, the main acreage, the vehicles, even Evelyn's antique furniture collection. Walter listened quietly while snow tapped softly against the windows behind them. 40 years. He had repaired fences on that ranch in blizzards, dug calves out of snowbanks at 2 in the morning, replaced water lines with numb fingers while Evelyn slept beside a heater because her lungs couldn't handle the cold anymore. And yet his name barely surfaced. Richard turned another page. To Walter Hayes, Evelyn leaves sole ownership of the cabin property located near Bitterroot National Forest, including surrounding undeveloped acreage listed under Parcel 14B. Silence. Cole actually laughed once under his breath. Walter looked up slowly. Richard continued carefully. The property includes approximately 43 acres of wooded land and an existing residential structure. Residential structure, Cole muttered. That's generous. Diane shot him a warning glance, though not because she disagreed, because she wanted him quieter. Walter stared at the papers in front of the attorney. The cabin. He remembered Evelyn mentioning it once years ago. Some old hunting place her uncle used decades back before it fell apart. "You're serious?" Cole asked. "That dump's barely accessible half the year." Richard ignored him. "There is also a maintenance account attached to the property for tax and utility purposes." Diane folded her arms. "How much?" Richard checked the document. "Enough to sustain basic upkeep for several years, assuming standard usage." Cole snorted again. "Well, lucky him." Walter said nothing. The room suddenly felt too warm, not because of anger, because something inside him had started collapsing quietly inward. Richard slid a small envelope across the table. "This was left specifically for you, Mr. Hayes." Walter picked it up carefully. Inside sat an old brass key attached to a faded leather tag and one folded note. The handwriting hit him harder than anything else had. Evelyn's handwriting. Slightly shaky near the end from the medications, but still unmistakably hers. "If you stop trusting people, trust Ranger." That was all. No explanation. No goodbye. Walter read it twice, then a third time. His throat tightened unexpectedly. Trust Ranger. Not trust Diane. Not trust lawyers. Not even trust her. Trust the dog. Richard continued discussing legal timelines, property transfers, signatures. Walter barely heard any of it after that. His mind kept circling the same thought. Why the dog? By the time the meeting ended, Diane already sounded more interested in sale estimates than mourning. "We should list before heavy snow season next year," she said while gathering papers. "Developers are still paying decent money for ranch land." Cole nodded. "And if the hunting company stays interested, we can probably split sections separately." Walter remained seated. They spoke like the ranch already belonged entirely to them. Maybe it did. Richard handed Walter the final documents. "The cabin utilities are active," he said quietly. "Road access can get rough early winter, just so you know." Walter nodded once. As he stood to leave, Diane finally looked at him directly. "You can stay at the ranch another couple weeks while you figure things out." Another couple weeks. Like he was a tenant. Walter studied her face for a moment. He remembered driving her to school in snowstorms, sitting through volleyball games, teaching her how to patch fence wire after windstorms tore sections down. None of those memories seemed to live inside her anymore. "Appreciate it," he said softly, and that hurt worse than anger would have. Outside, the cold air hit him hard. Ranger barked once from inside the truck the second he appeared. Walter climbed in slowly. The dog immediately pushed his head against Walter's chest, like he'd been waiting anxiously. Walter rested one hand on Ranger's neck. "She left us a cabin boy." Ranger stared at him. 43 acres nobody wants." The dog's tail tapped once against the seat. Downtown Helena blurred past outside the windows as Walter drove south toward the ranch, one final time. The mountains looked pale beneath heavy clouds. Everything felt temporary now, even the road home. That night the farmhouse buzzed with tension. Diane spent hours on the phone in the kitchen. Cole drank whiskey while searching property maps online at the dining table. Walter stayed mostly silent. Ranger followed him from room to room. Near midnight, Walter stepped outside onto the back porch for air. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The cattle fields stretched dark beneath moonlight. From inside the house, voices carried through the screen door. "She got sentimental near the end," Cole said. "That's all this was." "It doesn't matter," Diane answered. "Once Walter realizes that cabin's worthless, he'll probably sell it cheap anyway." Walter stood perfectly still. Then came the sentence that settled like ice in his chest. "The important thing," Diane said, "is keeping the ranch with the real family." Real family. Again. Ranger appeared beside Walter silently. The old dog looked toward the barn. Low growl. Quiet at first, then stronger. Walter frowned. "That's enough," he murmured. But Ranger didn't stop. The dog moved down the porch steps into the dark yard. Ears forward now, focused on the old equipment shed beside the barn. Walter followed slowly through the cold. The shed door rocked faintly in the wind. Ranger stood stiff near it, growling deep in his throat. Walter had seen that posture before. Not fear, alert. Like the dog had caught something wrong. Walter reached for the rusted handle and pulled the door open. Darkness inside. Dust. Old tools. And somewhere near the back wall, Ranger kept staring at something. Walter couldn't yet see. Something hidden beneath years of forgotten junk. Something Evelyn apparently never wanted anyone else to find. Walter reached past a stack of rusted fillet buckets and old fence posts while Ranger stood rigid beside him. His fingers brushed cold metal. A lockbox, small, green, military style. Walter pulled it free from the dust. The padlock had already been cut years earlier. Inside sat a folded road map. Several receipts clipped together with a rubber band gone brittle from age, and a set of keys marked with faded blue tape. Bitterroot Cabin. Walter stared at the words for a long moment. Ranger whined softly beside him. The receipts showed fuel deliveries, propane refills, generator maintenance, snow removal, recent dates, not abandoned. maintained for years. Walter lowered himself slowly onto an overturned bucket while cold wind slipped through gaps in the shed walls. Evelyn had kept this place running all along, without telling him. He unfolded the road map next. A narrow route had been marked by hand in red ink, leading deep into the Bitterroot Mountains west of Missoula. Small handwritten notes filled the margins. Bridge unstable after heavy snow. Use lower trail if creek rises. Generator switch behind woodpile. Walter recognized Evelyn's handwriting instantly. The realization unsettled him more than the inheritance itself. She had planned for him to go there, carefully, deliberately. Ranger nudged the map with his nose, tail moving once. Walter looked down at the old dog. "You knew about this place?" Ranger simply stared back. The next morning, Walter packed before sunrise. Not much to pack anyway. A duffel bag, work clothes, medication bottles, old photographs he couldn't bring himself to leave behind. The ranch already felt different, like the walls themselves had stopped recognizing him. Diane barely looked up from her laptop when he carried boxes through the kitchen. Cole stood outside talking with a man in camouflage about acreage lines and access roads. Nobody asked Walter to stay. Nobody asked where he was going. Ranger climbed into the truck before Walter even opened the passenger door fully. Smart dog. The snow had mostly melted down in the valley, but dark clouds clung to the mountains ahead. Walter filled the truck at a gas station outside Helena, bought coffee he barely tasted, and pointed the old Ford west. Mile after mile rolled beneath the tires. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became. Small towns gave way to open stretches of pine forest and steep rock faces dusted with late snow. Rivers cut silver lines beside the highway. Elk warning signs appeared every few miles. Ranger watched the road the entire time. Alert, like he recognized parts of the route. That bothered Walter more than he wanted to admit. By late afternoon, the highway narrowed into two-lane mountain roads twisting through Bitterroot National Forest. Rain started suddenly, cold and steady. The windshield wipers squeaked across the glass in uneven rhythm. Walter's hands tightened instinctively on the steering wheel. Narrow roads at dusk still did things to him sometimes, especially in bad weather, especially with trees packed tight against both sides. His brain knew this wasn't Iraq. His body didn't always care. A logging truck thundered past the opposite direction, spraying muddy water across the windshield. Walter flinched hard. For half a second, he saw convoy lights through desert dust again. Heard radio static in his ears, felt that old pressure inside his chest that used to arrive right before contact. Ranger barked once sharply, grounding him. Walter exhaled slowly. "I'm good," he muttered, though his pulse still hammered. Rain turned to wet snow as elevation climbed. The marked turnoff finally appeared near dusk. Easy to miss. Just an old Forest Service sign, leaning sideways beside a dirt road. Walter almost drove past it. The road immediately narrowed into mud and slush. Branches scraped both sides of the truck. Deep ruts pulled at the tires. No cell signal, no other vehicles, nothing except forest and fading daylight. The kind of isolation most people avoided. Walter understood suddenly why Cole had laughed. Then Ranger sat upright, ears forward, excited. "You really know this road," Walter said quietly. The dog's tail thumped against the seat. After nearly 40 rough minutes, the trees finally opened, and there it was. The cabin sat beside a creek at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. Not large, not fancy, but solid. Smoke stains darkened the stone chimney. A stack of chopped firewood rested beneath a covered lean-to. Snow had been shoveled recently from the front steps. Walter stopped the truck and stared through the windshield. This was not abandoned, not even close. Ranger jumped out. The second Walter opened the door, the dog ran straight toward the back of the cabin, like he'd been there yesterday. Walter followed slowly. Cold mountain air filled his lungs. Pine, wet earth, wood smoke lingering faintly in old timber. A generator shed sat half-hidden behind stacked logs. Tire tracks showed recent use despite the weather. Walter unlocked the cabin door with one of the blue-taped keys. Warmth did not greet him, but care did. The place smelled clean, dry, lived in recently. A cast-iron stove stood ready with kindling stacked beside it. Blankets folded neatly on a couch. Lanterns filled with fuel. Shelves stocked with canned food, coffee, batteries, first aid supplies. Not luxury, preparation. Like someone had expected hard winters here. Walter walked slowly through the small cabin, while floorboards creaked softly beneath his boots. One bedroom, tiny kitchen, old table near the window, and photographs, not family portraits, landscape, mountain trails, rivers, sunrise through pine trees, all taken by Evelyn. Walter recognized her eye immediately. Ranger scratched suddenly at the back door. Hard, Walter opened it. The dog bounded through light snowfall toward a woodshed behind the cabin. Again, always the woodshed. Walter followed him across the clearing. Ranger pawed furiously near the rear wall, where loose boards leaned against stacked timber. Walter moved the boards aside. Behind them sat several plastic storage bins protected beneath heavy tarp. His stomach tightened. More hidden things. He opened the first bin carefully. Road maintenance invoices, generator repair records, fuel receipts dating back nearly 8 years. The second bin held maps, trail maps, Forest Service access routes, emergency rescue paths marked carefully in red ink, and letters, dozens of letters, most addressed between Evelyn and someone named Eli Turner from the Montana Forest Conservation Service. Walter sat back slowly on his heels while snow drifted around him. Ranger rested beside the bins quietly now, watching Walter, instead of the woods. One letter sat loose near the top. Walter unfolded it carefully. Evelyn. The lower access trail should stay open through winter as long as funding continues. I still think what you're doing out here matters more than you realize. Eli Walter read it twice, then again. Funding? Doing what out here? The wind picked up through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the forest, branches cracked beneath heavy snow. Walter suddenly realized something that unsettled him more than anything else so far. Evelyn hadn't hidden this place because it was worthless. She had hidden it because it mattered. Walter barely slept that night. Wind rattled the cabin windows until nearly dawn. Snow slid from the roof in heavy thumps that kept jerking him awake. Every sharp sound pulled old instincts out of him before he could stop it. At one point, he reached toward the empty side of the bed, half expecting Evelyn's hand to be there. It wasn't. Ranger slept near the wood stove, with one eye half open all night, like he was keeping watch. By morning, the storms had moved east. Cold blue light filtered through the trees, turning the snow outside silver. Walter stood at the kitchen counter drinking black coffee while rereading the letters from the storage bins. Most of them were practical. Trail access, bridge repairs, emergency winter routes, nothing emotional. Nothing explaining why Evelyn had spent years hiding this place from him. But one thing became clear. This cabin had never been forgotten. Someone had been here constantly, maintaining it, protecting it, funding it. Ranger suddenly stood near the back door again. Alert, tail stiff. "You hear something?" Walter asked. The dog looked back once, then scratched at the door. Same behavior as yesterday. Walter grabbed his coat. Fresh snow cracked beneath his boots as he followed Ranger into the woods behind the cabin. The trees grew thicker almost immediately. Tall lodgepole pines blocked most of the morning sun, leaving long shadows stretched across the ground. Ranger moved confidently ahead, not wandering, leading. Walter noticed old trail markers nailed to trees every 50 yards or so. Small red metal tags nearly hidden beneath moss. Someone had maintained this route too. The path climbed gradually uphill through dense forest until Walter finally saw the structure through the trees. An old fire lookout station. Small, square, half-weathered gray from decades of snow and wind. It sat on a rocky rise overlooking miles of forest below. Ranger ran ahead and waited by the door. Walter climbed the wooden steps carefully. One board creaked loudly beneath his weight, and the sound instantly shot through his nerves like distant gunfire. For one brief second, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back inside a damaged outpost, overseas listening for incoming rounds in the dark. His breathing tightened automatically. Ranger pressed against his leg hard enough to break the spiral. Walter exhaled slowly. "Damn it," he muttered quietly. The lookout door opened easier than expected. Inside smelled like old cedar and cold dust. A folding table stood near the windows. Maps covered one wall. A propane heater sat in the corner beside stacked canned food and emergency blankets. Not abandoned either. Walter stepped farther inside. There were files here, too. Boxes labeled by year. Maintenance reports, forest access permits, search and rescue maps. He opened one folder carefully. Conservation easement agreements. Another. Wildlife Corridor Protection Program. Another. Volunteer winter access funding. Walter frowned. He understood enough ranch law to recognize what he was looking at. This land couldn't simply be developed however someone wanted. There were restrictions, environmental protections, agreements tied to state and federal conservation partnerships. No giant resorts, no aggressive commercial expansion, no easy money. Which meant Diane and Cole probably had no idea what Evelyn had actually done with this property. Walter moved toward the windows. The view stopped him cold. Miles of untouched forest stretched across the mountains below. Rivers cut through the valleys like dark ribbons beneath the snow. No roads, no subdivisions, no power lines. Just wilderness, beautiful and brutal and completely silent. Walter suddenly understood why Evelyn had loved this place. Out here, nobody expected anything from you. Nobody watched every word. Nobody measured whether you belonged. Ranger barked once near the far corner of the room. Walter turned. A green metal file box sat beneath an old bench. Inside were more letters. These were personal, not love letters. Not exactly. More like conversations between Evelyn and someone who understood her better than Walter realized anyone did. Eli. Walter had another rough night after the fireworks in Helena. He says he's fine, but he barely slept afterward. I wish he would talk to someone besides me. Another. Eli. The ranch doesn't feel like home for him anymore. Diane barely hides her resentment now. I keep hoping things will soften with time, but they never really do. Walter sat down slowly on the edge of the bench. His chest felt strange, heavy. Not because Evelyn had written these things, because she had seen them, seen him. All those years he thought he was quietly carrying the weight alone. She had noticed every bit of it. Another letter, shorter, almost frantic. Eli. If something happens to me before Walter understands what this place is, promise me you'll help him see it clearly. He needs somewhere nobody can force him out of. Walter stopped reading. Snow drifted softly against the lookout windows. Ranger lay quietly beside the door now, watching him. She knew, Walter whispered. The dog tilted his head slightly. She knew all of it. For a long time, Walter just sat there listening to the wind move through the trees below. Not angry anymore. That emotion had started changing shape. Now it felt closer to confusion and grief. Not only for Evelyn, for the life they might have had if either of them had ever said things out loud. Near the bottom of the final box, Walter found a folded topographic map marked heavily in red ink. One route circled repeatedly. Lower Winter Rescue Trail. Beside it was another note in Evelyn's handwriting. Paid through October. Keep accessible for emergency veteran transport if needed. Walter stared at the words. Emergency veteran transport. Not tourists. Not developers. Veterans. He suddenly remembered Evelyn disappearing for entire weekends some winters claiming she was helping church charity groups in Missoula. Had she been coming here instead? Helping people up in these mountains? The thought unsettled him deeply, because it didn't fit the version of Evelyn he thought he knew. Ranger stood again and walked toward the door. Walter followed him outside. The clouds had finally broken apart overhead. Sunlight spilled across the valley in cold gold patches. From up there, the cabin below looked impossibly small against the wilderness surrounding it. Small. Hidden. Protected. Walter shoved his hands into his coat pockets against the cold. Then he noticed something near the base of the lookout stairs. Fresh tire tracks. Recent, not his. A truck had been there sometime within the last day or two. Walter crouched automatically, studying the tread pattern. Old survival habits. The tracks headed back down the mountain toward a second trail. Walter hadn't noticed coming up. Ranger growled low in his throat. Walter straightened slowly. Someone else knew about this place, too. The snow started again before he made it back down to the cabin. Heavy this time. The kind that swallowed sound and erased tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. By dusk, the entire clearing had turned white. Walter locked the cabin door for the first time since arriving. Not because he truly expected danger, because old instincts never completely left a man, especially at night, especially in isolation. Ranger paced near the windows while wind rattled the trees outside. Every few minutes the dog stopped and listened toward the woods like he could hear something Walter couldn't. Walter kept replaying the tire tracks in his head. Maybe a forest worker. Maybe Eli Turner. Maybe nothing. Still, he checked the rifle above the fireplace before finally sitting down beside the wood stove. The fire cracked softly in the darkness. Warm orange light filled the cabin in uneven waves while snow hammered the roof overhead. Walter reached for the stack of letters again. He told himself he only meant to read one. Hours disappeared instead. Some letters were practical. Weather reports, supply lists, trail conditions. Others weren't. Eli. Walter still refuses to talk about the war unless he's half asleep or thinks nobody's listening. Last week, fireworks from the rodeo sent him outside behind the barn, shaking so badly he dropped a lantern. He acted embarrassed afterward, like pain is something shameful. Walter stopped reading. His jaw tightened. He remembered that night. He remembered Evelyn quietly sweeping broken glass afterward, without mentioning it once. Another letter. Eli. Sometimes I think he believes surviving was the same thing as living. I wish he understood there's a difference. Walter stared into the fire for a long time after that one. The wind howled harder outside. Ranger eventually settled beside his chair with a tired grunt, though his ears still twitched toward every noise beyond the walls. Walter opened another envelope carefully. This one wasn't addressed to Eli. It had his name written on the front. Walter. Nothing else. No, my love. No dramatic goodbye. His fingers hesitated before unfolding it. If you're reading this, then I probably waited too long to say most things. That sounded exactly like Evelyn. Plain, careful, honest only when cornered. The letter continued. I know Diane never accepted you. Cole followed her lead years ago. I kept believing time would soften them. I was wrong. Walter swallowed hard. Outside, snow slid heavily from the roof with a sudden crash. His shoulders jerked instantly before he could stop himself. Ranger lifted his head at once and pressed closer against Walter's boots. Walter rested one hand on the dog's neck until the tightness in his chest eased again. Then he kept reading. You spent years pretending their behavior didn't hurt you because you thought protecting me mattered more than protecting yourself. I saw more than you realized. Walter rubbed tired fingers across his face. That sentence hurt more than the cruel ones ever had, because he had believed she didn't notice, or worse, didn't care. The fire settled lower in the stove. Walter added another log while snow piled deeper against the windows. The next pages grew harder to read. There were things Evelyn admitted now that she never had while alive. Fear, Gillard, Cowis, I should have defended you more openly. I know that now. But every time I tried, it became war inside the family. And I was tired all the time near the end. Tired in ways I couldn't explain. Walter closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the oxygen machine humming beside their bed. The pills lined across the kitchen counter. The nights Evelyn would grip the edge of the sink, just trying to catch her breath. He had mistaken exhaustion for indifference. Maybe sometimes she had too. Another paragraph caught him completely off guard. The cabin became the only place where I could think clearly about what would happen to you after I was gone. Walter reread that line twice. Then again, after I was gone, she had known, long before he allowed himself to admit it. The snowstorm worsened overnight. By midnight, the cabin sat buried beneath drifting white walls of wind and ice. Power flickered once, then held steady. Walter couldn't sleep. He rarely could during storms anymore. Too many years of waking to alarms and sudden noise. Too many memories tied to darkness. At around 2 in the morning, he jerked awake in the chair beside the stove, heart hammering violently. For one terrifying second, he thought he heard incoming mortar fire again. Instead, it was only tree branches slamming against the roof under heavy snow. Ranger was already standing beside him, front paws braced, watching Walter, not the storm. It's okay, Walter whispered hoarsely. The dog didn't look convinced. Walter leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You ever get tired too, boy? Ranger slowly rested his head across Walter's lap. That nearly broke him. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just quietly. The way loneliness usually breaks older men. Walter stared at the fire while something inside him finally loosened after years pulled tight. I didn't know where I fit anymore after she died, he admitted softly. The cabin answered only with creaking wood and winter wind. I'm not sure I did before either. Ranger stayed there without moving, listening. The storm trapped them inside for 2 more days. Walter shoveled paths between drifts taller than the truck hood. He kept the stove burning, cooked canned soup, read more letters. Some were almost hopeful. Eli, if anything happens to me before Walter comes here, promise me you'll tell him. This place was never meant to isolate him. It was meant to protect him. Others hurt too much to finish in one sitting. Walter found himself talking aloud sometimes while reading them. Arguing with Evelyn even now. You should have told me. Or quieter things. You really saw all that? Ranger listened to every word. On the 3rd night, the storm finally weakened. The world outside turned silent again, beneath deep, untouched snow. Walter stood at the window before dawn, holding a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. The forest looked endless, empty, beautiful, and for the first time since the funeral, he realized he wasn't thinking about the ranch anymore. He wasn't thinking about Diane or Cole either. Only Evelyn, who she really had been, and how much of her life he apparently never understood. Then headlights appeared suddenly through the trees. Walter stiffened immediately. An SUV crawled slowly up the buried access road toward the cabin. Black, large, expensive enough that it clearly didn't belong out here. Ranger exploded into deep barking beside the door. Walter didn't need to see the driver to know who had found him. The SUV struggled through the snow before finally stopping crooked near the clearing. Diane stepped out first. Long wool coat, leather gloves, boots far too clean for Bitterroot winter roads. Cole climbed out behind her, already irritated, slamming the passenger door harder than necessary. Neither of them looked at the mountains. Neither looked at the forest. They looked at the cabin, evaluating it, pricing it. Ranger kept growling low in his chest. Walter rested one hand against the dog's neck before opening the door. Cold air rushed inside immediately. "Well," Diane said, glancing around the clearing, "this is definitely more than the attorney described." Walter said nothing. Cole looked toward the woods. "Road's a nightmare. Took us almost 40 minutes from the highway." "Then you should probably head back before dark," Walter replied calmly. Diane forced a tight smile. "We drove all this way to talk." Walter stepped aside just enough to let them enter. Snow melted off their boots onto the old wooden floor. Ranger never moved from Walter's side. The tension inside the cabin thickened instantly. Diane walked slowly through the room, studying everything. The wood stove, the shelves, the maps, the old photographs Evelyn had left tucked into frames near the fireplace. Cole wandered farther, peeking through doorways like he was already imagining renovations. "This place could actually be worth something," he muttered. Walter's jaw tightened. Diane finally removed her gloves carefully. "We've been contacted by a private recreation company out of Bozeman." Walter stayed quiet. "They specialize in guided hunting retreats, luxury cabins, wilderness tourism." She paused. "They're interested in the surrounding acreage, too." "There it is," Walter said softly. Diane frowned slightly. "What? The real reason you came?" Cole crossed his arms. "Look, nobody's trying to screw you over." Walter almost laughed at that. Almost. "The company wants survey access first," Diane continued quickly. "Road evaluations, land use assessment, basic stuff." Walter stared at her for several seconds before answering. "And after that, they'd probably make an offer." Walter looked around the cabin slowly. The stove Evelyn picked out years ago, the quilts folded carefully near the couch, Ranger lying beside the fire, the silence outside. "No," he said. Cole blinked. "No, no surveys. No development access. No contracts." Diane's patience cracked a little. "Walter, be realistic. You can't maintain all this yourself forever. I'm maintaining it right now. You're 73 years old." Walter met her eyes, and still standing. That shut her up for a second. Cole started pacing near the windows. "Do you even understand what this land could bring in?" Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he remembered Evelyn's notes: wildlife corridors, rescue access, conservation agreements, things Diane clearly knew nothing about. "You should leave," Walter said quietly. Diane exhaled sharply. "You always do this," Walter frowned. "Do what?" "Act like a victim while pretending you're above everyone else." That landed harder than she probably intended. Not because it was true, because he had spent years wondering if maybe it was. Ranger stood immediately, sensing the shift in Walter's breathing. Cole wandered toward the back hallway. "What's back there?" he asked casually. "Storage." Cole kept walking anyway. Walter straightened. Don't. Cole ignored him. Ranger moved first, fast. 1 second he was beside the stove. The next he was blocking the hallway with his body, low and rigid, deep barking filling the cabin walls. Cole jumped backward instantly. Jesus Christ! Ranger didn't lunge, didn't bite, just held position like a soldier guarding a checkpoint. Walter saw the old fear flicker across Cole's face. Good. Call your damn dog off, Diane snapped. Walter stepped forward slowly. For years he would apologized automatically. Smoothed things over, tried to keep peace at his own expense. Not this time. He told you not to go back there. Cole's face reddened. That mutt almost attacked me. No, Walter said evenly. He warned you. Silence settled hard across the cabin. Wind rattled the windows. The fire popped sharply. Walter noticed his own hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. Diane folded her arms tightly. You seriously think you can hold this place forever? Walter looked at her carefully then. Really looked. For years he had seen Evelyn in her daughter's face. Now he only saw resentment, exhaustion, greed wrapped inside hurt that probably started long before Walter entered their lives. I think your mother wanted this land protected, he said quietly. Diane scoffed immediately. My mother barely even came here. That's not true. The words came out before Walter fully realized he believed them. Diane stared. Walter continued. She maintained roads up here, paid for winter access, worked with conservation groups. Cole laughed once under his breath. You actually buying into all that old cabin fantasy? Walter stepped closer now. Not aggressive. Certain. She hid this place for a reason. And what reason would that be? Diane shot back. Walter almost answered honestly. Because she didn't trust you. But he stopped himself. Years in uniform had taught him something important. Not every battle needed full firepower. She wanted peace, he said instead. Diane's eyes hardened. No, she wanted control. The room went cold after that, not from weather. From truth too ugly to ignore. Ranger slowly relaxed once Cole stepped away from the hallway, but the dog kept watching him carefully. Cole muttered something under his breath and headed toward the front door. This whole thing's insane. Diane lingered longer. For one brief second, Walter thought she might say something real. Something honest about Evelyn. Instead, she looked around the cabin again and said quietly, You really think she chose you over us? Walter answered without hesitation. No, that caught her off guard. I think she got tired of everyone fighting over pieces of her. Diane's expression flickered, just for a moment. Then it vanished again. She pulled on her gloves. You'll hear from attorneys eventually. Maybe. You can't stop progress forever. Walter looked past her toward the endless, snow-covered forest. Some places aren't supposed to become businesses. Neither of them replied to that. A few minutes later, the SUV disappeared slowly back through the trees. The clearing finally went quiet again. Walter stood near the porch, watching tire tracks disappear beneath fresh snow. Ranger limped toward him suddenly. Walter frowned immediately. Hey! The dog held one front paw awkwardly off the ground. Walter knelt fast. Blood spotted the snow near the porch steps. Small drops, fresh, his stomach tightened. Ranger must have stepped on something during the confrontation. Walter checked the paw carefully and found a deep slice near the pad. Glass. A jagged piece lay half-buried near the woodpile beside the cabin. Not old either, freshly broken. Walter looked toward the road where Diane and Cole had disappeared, then back at the blood on the snow. Ranger leaned weakly against him, but stayed silent. Walter slid one arm carefully beneath the dog's chest. You're okay, he said quietly, though his pulse had already started racing. The nearest veterinarian was over an hour away in good weather, and another storm was moving in fast across the mountains. Walter wrapped Ranger's injured paw with an old dish towel while the dog lay beside the stove, breathing hard through clenched teeth. "Easy," Walter whispered. Ranger never snapped, never even growled. That somehow made it worse. Blood kept seeping through the towel. Walter grabbed his keys immediately. Within minutes, the old pickup was crawling back down the snow-covered road through darkness and blowing wind. The storm hit hard halfway down the mountain. Snow slammed sideways across the windshield. Visibility shrank to almost nothing in places. Branches bent low over the road under fresh weight. Walter leaned forward tightly over the steering wheel, jaw clenched. The truck heater rattled weakly. Ranger lay stretched across the passenger seat, unusually still. Every few minutes, Walter reached over just to touch the dog's shoulder. Still breathing, still there. Headlights flashed suddenly through the trees ahead. Walter's pulse spiked instantly. For half a second, his brain dragged him backward again. Night convoy. Ambush risk. Unknown vehicle. His hands tightened hard enough on the wheel to ache. Then the truck passed harmlessly. Just a rancher hauling feed. Walter forced air slowly back into his lungs. "You're home," he muttered to himself. But the truth was, he still wasn't always sure where home actually was anymore. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of a small town called Darby. One flashing blue sign buzzed above the entrance. Bitterroot Animal Care. The parking lot was half buried in snow. Walter carried Ranger inside, wrapped in an old wool blanket. Warm air hit them immediately, along with the sharp smell of antiseptic and wet fur. A young receptionist looked up fast. "Oh my God, he cut his paw," Walter said. "Glass, maybe." Within minutes, a veterinarian named Dr. Lena Brooks guided them into a small exam room. Mid-40s, calm voice, practical eyes. The kind of person who had probably spent years handling frightened animals and stubborn mountain people. Ranger finally whimpered when she cleaned the wound. Walter looked away instinctively. Funny thing about war. A man could survive explosions and gunfire, and terrible things most people never wanted to imagine. But seeing his dog in pain still cracked him open. "He's lucky, Doctor," Brooks said while preparing stitches. "Deep cut but clean. No tendon damage." Walter nodded quietly. Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee during the procedure without taking his eyes off him once. Trust like that carried weight. Real weight. "You're staying up near Hayes Ridge, Doctor?" Brooks asked casually. Walter looked up sharply. "You know the cabin? Everybody around here does." That surprised him. Dr. Brooks tied off the final stitch carefully. "Evelyn brought Ranger here twice over the years. Mostly checkups." Walter blinked. "She did?" "Sure." Dr. Brooks smiled faintly. "That dog adored her." Walter sat very still after that. Another piece of Evelyn he hadn't known. Another hidden road in a marriage full of them. When the procedure finished, Dr. Brooks handed Walter antibiotics and strict instructions about keeping Ranger off the injured paw. Walter gave a tired half-laugh. Good luck explaining that to him. "You military?" The question caught him off guard. Walter nodded once. "Army." Figured. She didn't ask for details. People out here usually didn't. As Walter paid at the counter, voices drifted from the clinic waiting area near the coffee machine. Older men, laughing quietly. One of them glanced over and froze. "You're Walter Hayes." Walter frowned slightly. The man stood slowly from his chair, late 60s. Gray beard, heavy winter coat with a faded Marine Corps patch stitched near the shoulder. "Name's Marty Collins," he said. "Evelyn talked about you all the time." Walter stared at him. "She did?" "Sure did." Two other men nearby nodded in agreement. One used a cane. Another wore a Vietnam veteran cap pulled low over tired eyes. Walter suddenly noticed a donation plaque hanging near the wall beside the coffee station. Bitterroot Veteran Winter Relief Fund, supported privately by local contributors. One name appeared at the bottom: Evelyn Hayes. Walter looked at it silently. Marty noticed. "She helped a lot of folks up here," he said softly, "especially older vets living alone in the mountains." Walter swallowed hard. She never mentioned any of this. Marty exchanged a small glance with the others. She probably figured helping people matters more than talking about helping people. That sounded painfully like Evelyn. The men invited Walter to sit while Ranger recovered from sedation nearby. At first, Walter resisted. Old habit, keep moving, keep distance, but exhaustion finally won. Coffee appeared in front of him somehow. Bad coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. Exactly. The kind veterans always seemed to drink. Conversation drifted naturally after that. Snow conditions, generators failing during storms, a ranch fire outside Hamilton last winter. Nobody pushed Walter too hard. Nobody treated him fragile either. That mattered. A lot. Eventually, Marty leaned back in his chair and asked quietly, "You doing okay up there alone?" Walter opened his mouth automatically to say yes. The word never came out. Instead, he stared through the clinic window at snow blowing beneath parking lot lights. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he answered honestly, "I don't really know anymore." Silence settled gently around the table, not uncomfortable. Just listening silence. Walter rubbed tired hands together slowly. "Feels like..." He paused. "Feels like everybody already moved on from me before Evelyn even died." Nobody interrupted, so he kept talking. About the garage after the funeral. About feeling invisible inside his own home. About waking up some mornings already exhausted from pretending he was fine. He never mentioned combat directly. Didn't need to. Veterans recognized certain shadows without explanation. Marty nodded slowly once Walter finished. "Happens to a lot of us," he said quietly. "World gets smaller if you let it." Another man spoke from near the coffee pot. "Dogs help." Walter looked down automatically. Ranger lay sleeping under a blanket nearby, stitched paw wrapped carefully. The old shepherd looked tired now, gray around the muzzle, slower than he used to be, but still watching for Walter even in sleep. "He's the only reason I came up that mountain," Walter admitted softly. "No," Marty said gently. "He's probably the reason you stayed." That landed somewhere deep, too deep to answer right away. Near midnight, another man entered the clinic carrying snow across the floor with his boots. Tall, lean, Forest Service jacket dusted white. The moment he removed his hat, Walter recognized the name before the face. "Ellie Turner?" he asked. The man looked over immediately. Then his expression changed. "You're Walter." Not a question. Walter stood slowly. For a second, both men simply studied each other, two strangers connected by the same woman. Eli finally extended his hand. "I've been wondering when you'd make it to the ridge." Walter shook it. Firm grip, cold hands. "You knew Evelyn." Eli nodded once. For nearly 15 years, Walter expected jealousy, suspicion, something ugly. Instead, he only felt tired curiosity. Eli glanced toward Ranger sleeping nearby, then back at Walter. "She wanted you to find the place before winter got too deep." He hesitated. "There's something I should probably show you." Snow swirled outside the clinic windows while Eli led Walter down a narrow hallway toward a small office in the back. Ranger was still sleeping under sedation. Walter glanced back twice before following. The office looked exactly like Walter expected a forest ranger's office to look. Maps everywhere, coffee stains on paperwork. radio equipment stacked beside wildlife reports and avalanche warnings. Eli shut the door quietly behind them. Then he pulled a thick folder from the bottom drawer of an old metal cabinet. "She left copies with me 3 months ago," he said. Walter stayed standing. Eli handed him the folder carefully. On top sat official-looking documents stamped with county seals and conservation agency logos. Not dramatic, not secret millionaire paperwork, real-world paperwork. The kind built by lawyers and state agencies over years. Walter opened the first page slowly. Bitterroot Community Land Trust. He frowned. "What is this?" "A protected land agreement," Eli explained. "Evelyn helped establish it years ago with local conservation groups and a few private donors." Walter kept reading. The language was dense, but understandable enough. The forest acreage surrounding the cabin had been placed under permanent conservation protections. Logging restrictions, wildlife corridor preservation, emergency winter access requirements, and one line repeated several times: lifetime residential stewardship rights granted to Walter Hayes. Walter looked up. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means nobody can force you off the property while you are alive." Walter stared at him silently. "The land can't be turned into a luxury resort," Eli continued. "Can't be aggressively developed either. Certain limited uses are allowed, but major commercial expansion would violate the easement agreements." Walter thought immediately of Diane's investors, the hunting retreat company, the surveys. Suddenly, their urgency made sense. Eli leaned back against the desk. "Evelyn knew your stepkids would eventually try something once they realized the land had value. So she made sure the important parts couldn't be sold off easily." Walter lowered himself slowly into the chair across from him. "She did all this herself." "Mostly." Eli nodded. "Took years." Walter flipped through more pages. Funding agreements, maintenance provisions, emergency access partnerships. There was even a modest operating trust, established specifically for road upkeep, generator fuel, and winter maintenance around the cabin. Not wealth. Stability, security, a place to stay. That realization hit harder than money ever could have. Walter rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "She never told me any of this." Eli smiled sadly. "She was afraid if you knew, Diane would figure it out somehow." Walter almost argued, then stopped, because deep down, he knew Evelyn had probably been right. Diane noticed everything when money or property entered the conversation. Always had. Eli opened another folder and slid one page across the desk. This one was handwritten. Evelyn's handwriting. Walter recognized it instantly. "If Walter ever doubts why I did this, remind him of something for me. He spent most of his life believing he was temporary in other people's homes. I wanted to leave him one place where nobody could ever ask him to leave again." Walter stopped breathing for a second. Not literally, but close. The room blurred slightly around the edges. He looked away toward the snow outside the office window. Because suddenly, the weight of the past 40 years pressed against him all at once. Every dinner where he stayed quiet to avoid conflict. Every holiday where Diane introduced him simply as Walter. Every night he sat alone in the garage because going inside felt harder than staying out. Every moment he convinced himself endurance was the same thing as belonging. Evelyn had seen all of it. Not perfectly, not bravely enough sometimes. But she had seen it. Eli spoke gently. "She told me once that you never stopped carrying the war home with you." Walter gave a dry half-laugh. Guess she wasn't wrong. "She also said Ranger was the only creature stubborn enough to keep dragging you back toward people." That actually made Walter smile faintly. Small, but real. The first genuine smile since the funeral. Eli noticed. She loved that dog. Walter looked toward the hallway where Ranger slept. He loved her too. Silence settled between them comfortably after that. Not awkward. Just tired men sitting inside a warm room while snow buried the mountains outside. Finally, Walter asked the question sitting deepest in his chest. "Why help veterans?" Eli answered without hesitation. "Because of you." Walter frowned. "She told me once that after the military, people thank veterans publicly, but abandon them privately." Eli crossed his arms loosely. She hated that. Walter looked down at the documents again. The trust wasn't huge. No fantasy fortune hidden in the mountains. Just enough money to maintain the roads. Keep the cabin running. Protect the land. Enough for one older man and his dog to live quietly without being pushed aside. Maybe that was worth more anyway. Eli slid another envelope across the desk. "This came last month. Evelyn asked me not to give it to you unless you decided to stay." Walter stared at it for several seconds before opening it carefully. "Walter, if you are reading this, then you stayed through the first storm. That means the mountain already started working on you." He almost laughed through the sudden sting behind his eyes. That sounded exactly like her. The letter continued. "I know this cabin may feel small compared to the ranch, but small things can still save people. A warm room, a quiet trail, a dog who refuses to leave your side, a place where nobody asks you to prove you belong." Walter stopped there for a moment, because something inside him finally cracked open quietly. Not grief this time. Relief. Evelyn had not left him rich, she had left him anchored. A dangerous thing for a lonely old man to lose, and maybe the only thing truly worth protecting. Hours later, Walter finally carried Ranger carefully back to the truck. The storm had weakened outside. Snow drifted lazily beneath pale streetlights now, instead of crashing sideways through the mountains. Before Walter climbed into the truck, Eli stopped him near the parking lot. "One more thing." Walter turned. Eli handed him a business card. On the back, Evelyn had written one final sentence in blue ink. "Walter needs a place where nobody can throw him out again." Walter looked at the words for a long time. Then he folded the card carefully and placed it inside his jacket pocket over his heart. Ranger lifted his head weakly from the passenger seat as Walter started the engine. The old shepherd's tail tapped softly once against the blanket. Walter rested one hand gently against the dog's shoulder. "We're going home," he said quietly. And for the first time in many years, the word actually felt true. His peace lasted exactly 6 days. Then the certified letter from Helena arrived. Walter found it tucked inside the cabin mailbox beneath fresh snow. Ranger limped beside him slowly, his injured paw healing but still wrapped. The return address belonged to a law office. Walter already knew before opening it. Diane. The letter itself was polite in the coldest possible way. A formal request for mediation regarding disputed stewardship rights, land use limitations, and concerns surrounding Evelyn Hayes's mental condition during the final year of her life. Walter read the phrase twice. Mental condition. Something ugly tightened deep in his chest. Not anger. Something older than anger. The feeling of being erased by paperwork. Ranger nudged the back of Walter's hand lightly. Walter folded the letter carefully. Then he stared out at the mountains for a very long time. 3 months ago, he probably would have signed whatever they wanted just to end the conflict. 3 months ago, he was still apologizing for taking up space inside his own life. Now he wasn't sure anymore. The mediation took place the following Thursday inside a small county community building outside Hamilton. No giant courtroom, no dramatic television trial, just fluorescent lights, folding chairs, bad coffee, and tired people trying to avoid a legal fight. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof outside. Walter arrived early with Ranger beside him. The old shepherd moved slower now, but stayed close enough that Walter could feel his shoulder brushing his leg every few steps. Inside, Diane sat at one side of the room beside two attorneys. Cole leaned against the wall, staring at his phone. Neither greeted Walter. That no longer hurt the way it once had. Eli arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a weathered file box under one arm. Marty Collins showed up too. Then Dr. Brooks. Then Pastor Green from Darby. Then an older woman Walter recognized vaguely from the clinic coffee area. By the time mediation officially started, half the room was filled with people Walter barely knew. People Evelyn had quietly connected to this land over years. The mediator introduced herself calmly and explained the process. No raised voices, no grandstanding, just discussion. Diane's attorney began first. Professional tone, measured language. He questioned whether Evelyn fully understood the long-term financial consequences of the conservation agreements while dealing with declining health. Walter listened quietly. Then came the harder part. The implication that Walter may have influenced Evelyn during vulnerable periods near the end of her life. Cole finally spoke up from the wall. She isolated herself up there, he muttered. Nobody even knew what she was signing. Walter felt old instincts rising immediately. Defend, escalate, shut the threat down before it grows. His pulse quickened hard enough he could hear it. Ranger lifted his head from beneath Walter's chair instantly, grounding him again. Walter rested one hand lightly on the dog's neck. The room steadied. Eli spoke next, calm, clear. He described Evelyn's work with the Land Trust, stretching back nearly 12 years before her illness worsened. She attended meetings personally, Eli explained. Reviewed every agreement herself. Asked detailed questions most people wouldn't even think to ask. The mediator took notes carefully. Then Marty Collins stood. Not dramatically, just slowly, like an older man whose knees bothered him in cold weather. Evelyn helped keep winter access routes open for veterans living off-grid in these mountains, he said. Without those routes, some folks out here would have been stranded during storms. Several others nodded quietly. Dr. Brooks spoke after him. Then Pastor Green. One by one, people described Evelyn not as a confused woman manipulated late in life, but as someone who had spent years building something deliberate, something practical, something meant to outlast her. Walter sat silently through most of it, not because he had nothing to say, because for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone inside the room. Diane eventually lost patience. She left us a ranch drowning in expenses while he gets protected land and lifetime rights. The mediator looked up carefully. And your concern is financial? Diane hesitated too long. That silence answered everything. Walter looked at her then, really looked. She looked exhausted, not evil, not monstrous, just trapped inside years of resentment she probably no longer understood herself. For a brief second, Walter almost pitied her. Then he remembered the funeral, the last row at the church, the way she said real family. Something inside him finally settled. Not hatred, acceptance. The mediator eventually turned toward Walter directly. Mr. Hayes, she asked gently, what outcome are you seeking here today? The old Walter would have stumbled through that question. Would have tried keeping everyone comfortable. Would have apologized before speaking. This version didn't. Walter straightened slowly in his chair. Ranger remained stretched across his boots like a sentry. I'm not asking anybody for money, Walter said quietly. The room fell still. I'm not trying to take anything from Diane or Cole. He glanced toward them briefly. The ranch was theirs. Maybe it always was. Diane's expression flickered slightly. Walter continued. But Evelyn left me one place where I wasn't treated like temporary company. His voice remained calm. And I'm not signing that away. Nobody interrupted him. Outside, wind moved softly through bare trees beyond the parking lot windows. Walter looked toward the mediator again. I spent a long time believing peace meant staying quiet. He paused. Turns out sometimes peace is just finally saying no. The words surprised even him. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. Silence filled the room afterward. Not hostile silence. Thinking silence. The mediator eventually closed her folder. Based on the documentation and witness statements, there appeared to be no grounds for invalidating the stewardship agreements or conservation protections. Further litigation would likely become expensive for everyone involved. Diane stared down at the table without speaking. Cole swore quietly under his breath. And just like that, it was over. Not perfectly, not emotionally, but legally enough. People slowly gathered their coats and paperwork. Conversations resumed in low voices around the room. Walter stepped outside into cold afternoon air, feeling strangely unsteady. Not weak. Lighter, Ranger followed him carefully down the icy steps. Halfway across the parking lot, Walter stopped. For years, he had lived waiting for someone else to decide whether he belonged somewhere. At the ranch, at family dinners, inside his own marriage sometimes. Even after Evelyn died, part of him still expected someone to eventually hand him another box and tell him to leave quietly. But nobody was doing that now. Nobody could. Ranger sat beside him in the snow, watching calmly. Walter looked down at the old dog. "You knew before I did, didn't you?" Ranger's tail thumped once against the slush. Walter laughed softly under his breath. Not bitter this time, just tired and real. As he reached for the truck door, Eli stepped out of the building behind him. "There's one more thing," Eli said. Walter turned. "The old equipment barn near the East Ridge," Eli asked. "Roofs collapsing." Walter frowned slightly. "So?" Eli smiled faintly. "You should probably decide what kind of future you want before spring." Walter thought about those words for weeks afterward. At first, he told himself he was too old to build anything new, too tired, too late. That kind of thinking had lived inside him a long time. But winter eventually loosened its grip on the mountains. Snow melted from the trails. The creek behind the cabin thawed into fast-moving water again. Morning sunlight returned to the clearing earlier every day and slowly. Walter started moving too. The old equipment barn near the East Ridge looked terrible when he first walked through it with Ranger. Roof sagging. Broken windows. One wall leaning enough to make Eli nervous, but the frame underneath still held strong. Walter recognized that feeling. Every morning he worked a little. Some days it was only clearing debris. Other days he hauled lumber with help from Marty Collins and two younger guys from town who owed Eli favors. Ranger followed him everywhere despite the healing paw. Always watching, always nearby. The work settled something inside Walter's chest. Not because he was rebuilding a barn. Because he finally understood he was building a reason to stay alive past survival. That spring, a younger veteran named Travis arrived at the cabin after Eli sent him up the ridge. Early 30s, former Army mechanic. Eyes that never rested in one place too long. Walter recognized the look immediately. Travis brought a skinny rescue dog riding beside him in the truck. Some shepherd mixed with one torn ear and nervous habits. The dog shook whenever doors slammed. Travis wasn't much different. Eli said, "Maybe you needed help fixing the barn," he muttered awkwardly. Walter nodded toward the tools. "Only if you're willing to work." That became the beginning of it. Not therapy, not speeches, work, simple things, replacing boards, clearing trails, fixing fences before summer storms rolled in. Ranger took to the younger dog almost immediately, patient with him, steady, showing him where water sat coolest near the creek, where shade stayed longest in afternoon heat. Walter watched the two dogs together one evening while sunlight burned orange through the trees. "You trained him well," Travis said quietly. Walter shook his head. "No," he replied. "Truth is, he trained me." That summer more people started appearing. A widower from Missoula who'd stopped talking to most of his family after Vietnam. An older Marine, living alone in a camper through winter because rent prices had swallowed his retirement check. A former nurse named Helen, whose husband died 2 years earlier, and who admitted she mostly came because she was tired of eating every meal alone. Nobody called it a program. Nobody handed out brochures. People simply arrived and stayed a while. Walter converted the repaired barn into something simple but warm. A common room with a wood stove, 2 small sleeping spaces upstairs, tables built from reclaimed pine, coffee always on. He added dog kennels beside the barn, after Travis suggested partnering with a local rescue group that trained search and trail dogs. "Veterans and rescue dogs kinda understand each other," Travis said one afternoon. Walter realized he was right. Both carried invisible damage. Both flinched at things other people overlooked. Both needed patience more than pity. By early fall, Hayes Ridge had quietly become something real. Not famous, not wealthy, just useful, and useful mattered. Walter still had difficult nights sometimes. Certain storms pulled old memories too close. Sudden loud noises still tightened every muscle in his body before his mind caught up. But now, when sleep abandoned him, there were lights sometimes glowing from the barn below. Voices, coffee brewing, people awake who understood silence without demanding explanations. Ranger aged fast that final year. Walter noticed it slowly at first. Longer naps, slower climbs up the ridge trail, stiffness in the mornings. The gray around his muzzle spreading wider every month. But every sunrise, the old shepherd still followed Walter outside. Always. One cold October morning, Walter stood near the ridge overlooking the valley, while fog drifted low through the trees below. Ranger rested beside his boots in the tall grass. The dog no longer ran ahead much. Now he preferred simply staying close. Walter understood that too. Behind him, laughter drifted faintly from the barn. Travis was teaching another veteran how to work with a nervous rescue dog near the lower fence line. Helen had started cooking breakfast for everyone on Saturdays. Marty practically lived there now 3 days a week. Life had quietly rooted itself into the mountain. Walter looked down at Ranger. "You did all this, you know." The old shepherd blinked slowly in the morning sunlight. Walter smiled faintly. Maybe Evelyn had known all along that Walter would never follow a human being into healing willingly, but he would follow a dog, especially this one. Later that afternoon, Walter finally hung the wooden sign Travis had carved by hand above the entrance road. The letters were rough but solid. "Hayes Ridge no one gets." Left behind, Walter stared at the sign for a long moment after securing the final bolt. Those words used to belong to another life, another version of himself. Back when survival meant carrying people through gunfire and smoke. Now they meant something quieter. Stay, rest. You still belong somewhere. A truck rolled slowly into the clearing just before sunset. Young veteran, nervous eyes, thin rescue dog curled beside him on the seat. Walter recognized the expression immediately. The same one he carried after Evelyn died. The look of someone convinced they had nowhere left to go. Walter walked down from the sign while Ranger moved carefully beside him. The younger man stepped awkwardly from the truck. "I heard maybe this place helps people." Walter glanced once toward the barn glowing warm against the darkening trees, then toward the cabin Evelyn had hidden for all those years, the place she protected long before he understood why. Finally, Walter nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "Sometimes it does." The younger man looked relieved enough to nearly fall apart. Walter understood that feeling too. As darkness settled across the mountains, lights slowly appeared inside the barn windows, one by one. Voices drifted through cold autumn air. Coffee. Dogs barking somewhere near the creek. People alive together instead of alone. Walter stood quietly beside Ranger outside the cabin porch. The old shepherd lowered himself carefully onto the boards with a tired grunt and stretched beneath the fading sunlight. Walter looked out across the ridge. 40 years of marriage, months of grief, an entire lifetime spent believing he was temporary in other people's homes. And somehow, the thing that finally saved him wasn't revenge, wasn't money, wasn't winning. It was a stubborn dog who refused to leave him behind long enough for him to finally find a place where nobody else would either. Walter sat down beside Ranger as the mountain wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time in many years, he did not feel like an extra guest in somebody else's life. He was home. And maybe that was the real thing Walter Hayes had been searching for all along. Not revenge, not money, not even forgiveness. Just one place in the world where nobody looked at him like he was temporary. A lot of people grow older feeling invisible, especially veterans, especially widowers, especially the ones who spent years carrying pain quietly because they thought nobody wanted to hear it. But this story reminds us of something important. Sometimes healing does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it shows up slowly beside you, with muddy paws, tired eyes, and enough loyalty to keep walking next to you until you finally believe your life still matters. Ranger never gave Walter speeches. He never asked him to explain his scars. He simply stayed. And sometimes that kind of loyalty saves a life more than words ever could. If this story meant something to you, tell me this in the comments. Do you believe a dog can sometimes understand a broken heart better than people can? Type 1 for yes, type 0 for no. And if you'd like to hear more stories about second chances, quiet courage, loyal dogs, and people finding their way back from loneliness, stay with the channel. There are more roads ahead, and more stories waiting at the end of them.